Video, I'd like to introduce students to Chapter 2 of Aristotle's Categories. In this chapter, we're going to really get into the core issues of classical reasoning, and I hope clarify a few points that are the source of confusion and false teaching in many circles, not only today but throughout history. So let's read through Chapter 2 together. I'll provide just a few comments to clarify some things, but as I said, I'm not going to pretend that these videos free a student from the work of studying on his own for mastery. I'm going to explain the things that I think are fair for an instructor to share to help sincere students without allowing pretenders to just skip along watching videos and not doing the actual work of studying that needs to be done for them to progress through the art of reasoning in pursuit of its true goal. So let's read Chapter 2 together, and I'll make a few comments as I think it would be helpful for students. First of all, in Chapter 2, Aristotle identifies the subject of this study, and really the subject of all reasoning. And this is the first point where false teachers fall off course. This first sentence says, "Of things which are the subject of discourse." Of things which are the subject of discourse. And there's a lot of information packed into that statement, which you can only know if you sincerely study the classical liberal arts. What Aristotle says there is that we're talking about things which are the subject of discourse. What does that mean? Well, even in the petty school lessons, and then certainly in grammar, I teach students that language is the means by which we express or share ideas. Language is used to communicate ideas. Objects exist in the created world, things that are both material or physical and things that are immaterial. We could say spiritual, but not spiritual in the Christian sense where we talk about persons that are spirits, but simply things that are not present physically. Okay? Language is used not to express or represent objects themselves, but language is used to express ideas, mental images of those objects, or simple mental ideas that don't necessarily represent any objects at all, but the ideas are the objects themselves. So language is used to express ideas. And what Aristotle says here is, of things which are the subject of discourse, things we speak about. When he says that, he's referring to ideas. We're talking about an intellectual study. We're talking about the art of reasoning. This is not natural philosophy. We're not talking about animals and plants as they exist in creation, physically, sensibly, and so on. This is not a study of natural philosophy or physics. This is the art of reasoning. Everything that Aristotle is teaching in this book exists in our minds. The study of the categories, which we're going to get into in a few chapters, is a study of human thoughts and words by which thoughts are named and shared. So we're not talking about natural physical things, and that's a very important point to make, because at the time of the Protestant Reformation, Aristotle was largely rejected by Protestants. And the reason why is because they didn't understand, not that they couldn't, but they were blinded by their false ideas. They could not read Aristotle and understand what he was talking about. And so what they did was they took his teaching in reasoning and they imagined to prove it false by natural philosophy. And all they did was prove that they themselves were misusing and misreading the work of Aristotle on reasoning. This is not about the natural world outside of the human mind. This is about the human mind itself, the art of reasoning. We're studying things which are the subject of discourse. That means ideas. We're studying ideas. Some of these, this goes on in the reading, some of these are enunciated according to connection. Some of these are enunciated or spoken in a compound way, joined together with other ideas. Some are enunciated according to connection. But other ideas are enunciated or spoken without connection, simply. Those, therefore, which are enunciated according to connection are such as these, and he gives us a few examples. The man runs. That's an example of speech that's compound. It's composed of a connection of ideas or words. First, man is an idea. And then runs is a different idea. And we connect these two ideas to say, man runs. And in the English here, we can even add the definite article, which represents another idea, and say, the man runs, and connect them together to form a compound idea, an idea enunciated according to connection, as the translation says. The man runs. The man is victorious is another example of enunciation of things according to connection or in a connected way. Those without connection or simple enunciations, and he gives us examples. Man, just the simple idea without connection, isolated or absolute. Man. Ox, the idea ox. Next, the idea runs, the verb. The idea of the verb, signified by the name of the verb, runs. That represents an idea. And then lastly, conquers. So we have simple speech that's enunciated without any connection, and compound speech, which is enunciated with connection. Okay? And then he gives us 4 different kinds of enunciations. All right, now, this is where I'm going to say, if you don't commit to the study of Aristotle, you will have no idea what he's talking about in the rest of this chapter. If you picked up this book, started with page 1, and just started reading page by page, when you get to chapter 2, there will be, if you were to read a chapter and then know the topic and move on to the next chapter, you would never get past chapter 2. Never. There's no way to understand this without first having already read through the whole work. All right? The reason I say that is because you can't be lazy like modern students are. Start to read something and say, oh, I don't understand this. Oh, I'm not good at this. Oh, if you do that, you're proving yourself to be exactly the kind of student that is not a student. You're proving yourself to be exactly the kind of person that Aristotle intended to prevent from moving forward in his philosophy. It's not some cute thing to say, oh, I'm not good at this. oh, I don't like this, oh, I can't understand this. Of course you can't. Study takes work. It takes patience. You have to not only study, but study the right way. And so I'm telling you, you can understand Aristotle if you will it, and if you're willing to follow instruction on how to study Aristotle. And it's not just Aristotle. This is the art of reasoning. There's no other place to go to learn this art. You can go to a different book. You can go find some lazy homeschool workbook that's called logic and study it instead of this, but you're just kidding yourself. Don't be that lazy, careless student that gets weeded out of true philosophy. You can do it, but you have to learn how, and you have to persevere. What I told you in lesson 1 is that to understand the teaching of Aristotle, you have to read all of Aristotle's works. And it's sort of what I used to tell my students in class was the study of Aristotle is a cycle of studies. You study through it once, you go back to the beginning, and now you understand what he's talking about in the beginning because you've read the middle and the end, and you come back to the beginning and you understand it more. And you read through all the works again, and you start over. You go back to the first lesson, and now you understand it more. And by reading through the works of Aristotle in this cyclical way, you understand more and more each time. Now, you don't need to really be taught this, because you practice it all the time. If you watch a movie, a really great movie, a well-made movie that's got a great plot, great story, great actors, well-produced, the first time you watch the movie, you really have no idea what to expect. You have no idea whether it's going to be good or not. And then you get to the end of the movie and you say, wow, that was an awesome movie. And then what do you want to do? When you get to the end of the movie, you realize, now that I know the whole story, now that I know the whole movie, all of the different parts of the movie now make more sense. Now I understand why in the opening scene the actor said this. Now I know in that one part why the actor did this, or why it was in that scene, or why that was important. I didn't understand it the first time I watched it, but now that I've seen the whole movie, now all of the different parts of the movie make sense within the context of the whole story and the end of the story. And so now you're eager to watch it again. And you go back to the beginning, and if it's a great movie, you love it even more the second time, because now you start to notice all of these different things that you didn't notice the first time. And you can watch it a third time and a fifth time. You can watch it for years and years. And every time you watch the film, you see more and more. More and more makes sense along the way. There's more and more important points. And someone who watches it for the first time doesn't understand anything. And that's why we're always tempted to talk during the movie and say, oh, this is important because you have to pay attention. And we say, be quiet, you're spoiling the movie. But it's because you understand that what's said in the beginning is important, and the person watching for the first time doesn't understand that. The same is true of the study of Aristotle, and really the same is true of any work to be studied. The Bible is the same way. The more you study the Bible, the more you understand the Bible, the more and more valuable it becomes. If you don't study it, you pick it up and read it, you say, It's just like watching a movie into the first scene, not understanding what's going on, and saying, oh, this movie's dumb, and not watching it. That's what you do as a student. And it's a habit that you have to learn not to do. And as I said, you probably don't do it with reference to other things, like movies that you enjoy. Okay? So, you can learn Aristotle, but you have to study it in the right way. You have to be sincere, you have to want to be wise, and you have to pursue it and persevere in it until the end. Okay? And that begins by just reading through his works. Just reading through his works. Seeing what's there, seeing where he brings you in the end, understanding that you don't understand every point as you go, but planning to come back to the beginning with more understanding and studying it again and doing that again and again and again. And if you pursue wisdom in your life, you're going to be doing this your entire life. That's what wisdom is. Okay? So, what follows in this chapter, impossible to understand on your first reading. I can help you a little bit, and I don't want to just spoon feed you because that's going to make you dumb and lazy. I'm going to tell you what I think is helpful for a student to know as he makes his first reading, and then challenge you to continue with me through the book and study for mastery on your own. Okay, so let's go through this second chapter, and I'm just going to make a few more comments. Of these things which are the subject of discourse, as I said, some are predicated of a certain subject. That's quality number one. Predicated of a certain subject, but are not in any subject. So for each of these four different types of speech, or things which are spoken, he's going to focus on two qualities that differ between them. Okay? The first quality is whether or not it is predicated of a certain subject. And secondly, whether or not it is in a certain subject. Okay? I'm not going to explain what those things mean. We're going to learn them as we continue in the categories and on interpretation and through the rest of the works of Aristotle on reasoning. But what I want you to see is there's four different types of spoken things, and they differ in these two characteristics: whether or not they're predicated of any subject, and whether or not they exist in a subject. Okay? The first of these four types of speech, predicated of a subject, but not in any subject. And he gives us an example. Thus, man. Man is an example. Man is predicated of a subject, namely of a certain man or an individual man. So if I were to see Socrates on the road and I were to ask someone, this is just theoretically speaking, what is that? Someone would say, Socrates is a man. Man is predicated of an individual man. But man, the idea of man, is not present in that subject, does not exist in that subject. The idea of man does not exist in the subject of that individual man. All right? Man is predicated of a subject, of a certain man or an individual man, but is not in any subject. That's the first kind of spoken thing. Man is an example. Predicated of a subject, but not in any subject. Second, some things are indeed in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. Some things are in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. Okay? And then he goes and explains to a degree what he means by this phrase, being in a subject. Okay? He says, by being in a subject, I mean that which, subsisting in something not as a part, cannot exist without that in which it is. All right, now, what is Aristotle doing here? he's doing exactly what he taught us to do in chapter 1. When he when he uses the phrase are not in any subject or is in a subject, in his mind, being a wise and true man, he knows, wait a minute, the phrase in something has a number of different possible meanings. You know, like I can say I am in North Carolina, and that has one meaning. And I could say that there are 100 cents in a dollar, and that has a different meaning. I can say you're in trouble, and that's a different meaning. It's a different sense. It's sort of metaphorical. It's not exactly the same as I am in North Carolina or my eyes are in my body. It's different senses. And so he takes a moment here to do exactly what he explained needs to be done in chapter 1, to remove the ambiguity of terms. Okay? He says, when I say that a thing is in a subject, I don't mean in it as a part exists in a whole. That's not the idea that I mean. All right? He says, what I mean is that it cannot exist without that in which it is. That's what I mean when I say in a subject. I mean that without that subject, the idea spoken cannot exist. All right, so we see Aristotle giving us an example of his own teaching where he removes ambiguity in the use of terms to make his meaning clear and to prevent false understanding of what he's teaching. All right? Thus, remember the second kind of spoken thing he says, things which are in a subject, which cannot exist without that in which they are said to be. Okay? The second category of spoken things, things which are in a subject but are not predicated of any subject. All right? And he gives us now an example. Thus, a certain grammatical art, and when he uses the word certain in this translation, it means individual or a particular grammatical art, is in a subject, and he tells us what the subject is, namely in the soul. An individual grammatical art is in the soul, but it is not predicated of any subject. Now, again, I guarantee reading this, you have no idea what he's talking about. And that's intentional. Aristotle knows you don't know what he's talking about. But he's introducing this concept as sort of an outline of what he's going to teach in the following chapters. No one opens a book and looks at the table of contents and closes the book and says, I don't know what this book is about. I'm reading through the table of contents and I don't know what any of these words mean. Of course you don't. It's just the table of contents. Aristotle is showing us that there are 4 classes of spoken things. He's showing us this as an outline for what he's going to teach us in the following chapters. All right? The first class of things, he says, those which are predicated of a subject but are not in any subject. And then he says, those which are in a subject but not predicated of any subject. Then he goes on to say, let's go down, I think it's the next page. Some things are both predicated of a subject and in a subject. And then lastly he says, some things are neither in a subject nor are predicated of a certain subject. For example, a certain man, a certain horse, and so on. For nothing of this kind is either in a subject or is predicated of a certain subject. And in short, this is this little summary here that's helpful. Individuals and things which are one in number are indeed predicated of no subject. Yet nothing hinders but that some of them may be in a subject. For a certain grammatical art is among the number of things which are in a subject, but not predicated of any subject. Now, I know I ran through that quickly, but what I want you to see is what Aristotle is doing in this second chapter, setting us up as his students for what he intends to teach and explain in the following chapters, in the categories. Okay? And I'll provide you with a helpful little summary here, just to help you out. And again, not to replace your need to study, but to help you study. That's the role of a teacher. The role of a teacher is to help a student study, not to replace the need for study. What Aristotle's saying here, first of all, he says that there are spoken things. We're talking about things which are spoken of, namely ideas. And he says that there are two different kinds of spoken things. I'm just plugging in my charger here as my phone's battery gets low. One moment. Okay. He says there are two kinds of spoken things. There are things which are spoken in connection as compound expressions, and there are things which are spoken in separation as simple ideas. Okay, he starts the chapter with that. But then he gets into the real focus of the lesson, and he says, of spoken things, I'm going to use the word predicables, things that may be spoken. Of spoken things, there are four general classes of things, and they're grouped based on two characteristics: whether or not they can be predicated of subjects, and whether or not they exist in subjects. Okay? So if we were to start and say, okay, the first class are things which may be predicated of a subject, yet are not in any subject, yet do not exist in any subject. All right? The second class of things, let me just get back to the text so I can read his words exactly. The first class of things, those which are predicated of a certain subject, but are not in any subject. The second class of things, those which are in a subject, but are not predicated of any subject. The third class of things, those which are both predicated of a subject and in a subject. And lastly, those which are neither in a subject nor are predicated of a subject. He then goes on to tell us that when he says not predicated of a subject, he's referring to things that are individuals. Okay? So there's two classes of individuals. Individuals, like an individual man or an individual animal, like this animal right here. This man, William Michael, is an individual. All right? Any individual thing that actually exists, any individual thing, may not be predicated of anything else. There is nothing that you would find in the world, ask, what is this? And the answer would be, oh, that is William Michael. William Michael's an individual. It will never be predicated of something else. Okay? That's an individual. Socrates, that specific horse in the pasture, will not be the predicate of any sentence. All right? Individuals are not predicated. Yet individuals may exist in a subject or not exist in any subject. And so there are two different kinds of individual things which are spoken. And that's two of these four classes. The other two classes, things which may be predicated, form two other classes. And so we have four classes based on two qualities. Two of these are substances, and two of these are, we could call them attributes. When we study the categories in the future lessons, what we're going to learn is that Aristotle identifies 10 categories of things. The first category is substance, or essence, but let's say substance. It's different from the other 9 categories. The other 9 categories are attributes of substances. So the first category is going to be a substance. The other 9 are attributes. Of these 4 categories of things that we read here in chapter 2, the first is called a secondary substance. You don't need to know this now. I'm just giving you a little preview. The first is called a secondary substance. The last is called a primary substance. These are the 2 different kinds of substances, which is the first of the 10 categories. The second and third class that he describes here in chapter 2 consist of the other 9 categories of attributes. All right? And that's all that I'm going to say here. I know, as you get started in this study, that what I am saying is not perfectly clear. I know that. But in another chapter or 2, you're going to say, what Mr. Michael explained in that video is very helpful. Okay, I'm telling you this as a teacher who knows what you're about to study and learn. What you need to understand here, first of all, is that Aristotle is talking only about spoken things, things that exist in our minds. We're studying the art of reasoning. And that there's 4 classes of spoken things based on whether they can be predicated of subjects and whether they exist in a subject. Substances do not exist in any other subject. That's why they're called substances. They stand alone. Okay? The first and the fourth class of things Aristotle describes here in chapter 2 are 2 different classes of substances that we're going to study. Secondary substances and primary substances. Primary substances do not exist in any other subject, and they are not predicated of any other subject because they're individuals. The second and third class are 2 different classes of attributes, things which exist in a subject. They can't exist apart or without that subject. A good example, if you've studied grammar, adjective nouns cannot exist by themselves. That's what it means to be an adjective. There must be a substantive noun present, either expressed or understood, in order for an adjective noun to be used, because adjectives exist in substantives. You see that? That's in grammar. That's in grammar. And if you don't have a substantive, you cannot have an adjective. If you don't have a substantive, and notice in the word substantive, noun is substance. If you don't have a substantive, you cannot have a pronoun that refers to it. So you cannot use a pronoun. You cannot use an adjective unless there is a substantive. That's what we're getting into here, okay? 4 different kinds of spoken things. 2 of them are substances. 2 of them are different kinds of attributes. Attributes cannot exist without a substance. Some can be predicated, some can't be predicated. Substances exist in no other subject. Some of them can be predicated of other things. Some of them cannot. This is the content and the message of chapter 2 of Aristotle's Categories. It's time for you now to go and study this for yourself for mastery. Remember, as you study chapter 2, understand that it's your first reading. It's your first reading. We're going to read through the whole book. And you're going, if you want to pursue this learning in the future, you're going to have to go back and start from the beginning. And you'll understand all of these details with clarity, just like the first scenes of a movie after you've watched the whole movie. All I want you to see is the layout of the content of this chapter and understand what Aristotle's preparing to do in teaching you these things as we now study in following chapters each of the 10 categories of spoken things. I hope that's helpful.